You know, for a man that needs no introduction, you went into it pretty good. I'm not going to lie, I'm just humble enough to really appreciate introductions because they usually tell you how great I am. So, I don't know, you can be humble if you want to, but I like it when people say good things about me. I'm just being honest. The truth is that I find it very intimidating to speak to a group called the Oklahoma Business Ethics Consortium. Now, I don't know about you. I think I'm a pretty good guy. You know, I feel pretty good about myself, but I like to choose who I compare myself to. Okay? I'm a pretty good husband if you only look at these guys. You know, I'm a pretty good, but man, to get in where people value ethics, Travis, I think this is a cool deal. I was very blessed that not only to get asked to speak and to share with you, but to get to attend back in February when Clifton Talbert was here. And boy, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. We'll get to that. I first want to give you a little bit of the Paul Harvey story. The rest of the story, you guys, anybody old enough to remember rest of the story? When they introduced me as a champion coach, there is another side to the story, okay? And I think it's an important part of today because I'm proud to be a champion. I'm proud to be referred to as that, but I'm also the guy that in 1988 took our team to the championship game and got beat. In 94, we went again and got beat. In 98, we went again and got beat. In 99, we went again and got beat. In 2000, we went again and got beat. I didn't think I would ever win a championship. Okay? That's the reality of my life. I did get the joy, absolute incredible opportunity to go coach at my alma mater, the University of Tulsa. And we had some championship years. And I'll also stand before you as a guy that got fired by his alma mater. Okay, so when you say champion coach, understand that sometimes things aren't maybe as we all like to think. I've had a lot more speaking engagements this year, Travis, than I did the year after I got fired. Interesting, huh? But that's just the reality of the world we live in, and you live in it too. You know, maybe your job is not quite as out in everybody's public eye, but in your world, it's the same. And so I want to try to do some things to encourage you today and to give you a little bit, I hope, of a flavor of what I think coaching is. And again, it's my opinion. I think there's two words I want us to focus on today. Because when you call me a champion coach, and yet I told you all the ways that I publicly failed, there are two things that are going to be consistent in today's talk. We're going to talk about trajectory, and we're going to talk about impact. Okay, trajectory. Hope there's not a lot of physics gurus in the room. Okay, but in my simplistic coaching view, that trajectory, okay, is if I put a projectile, a bullet, a rocket, an airplane, and I put it on a trajectory, we're going to put it in a certain direction. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Each of these guys in our championship team are in a place in their life right now where there's a trajectory for their life. We're going to talk about that. You have a trajectory, I have a trajectory, but we also have impacts going on in our life. If you could just picture this, I'm going to use the term rocket because I just like that. I'm an old, I wanted to be an astronaut, but I didn't have all my teeth and all kinds of stuff. But if you can picture, and again, physics guys, we're eliminating gravity, we're eliminating the atmosphere, we're eliminating friction, but if we put ourselves on a trajectory, that trajectory is not going to change without something to alter it. Okay? Now, some are born into situations where just your trajectory starts out a little lower because of the circumstances in your life. Maybe it's poverty, maybe it's, you know it, parents that aren't at home, all kinds of obstacles. But that trajectory starts in a little different place. Everybody's life, when we get into this idea of trajectory, is we're going to have some things along the way that I'm going to call molehills, fences, walls, hills, mountains. Now, can you picture my flight path here? I may have the flight path to get over a couple of those, but eventually I'm going to run into something. If my path starts lower, my trajectory starts lower, even the little things are going to knock me off, right? So even the little molehills for some of us might knock somebody down that's not got the right trajectory, okay? Y'all are looking at me like, what in the crap is he talking about? I'm talking about these guys right here. And I'm talking about you, and I'm talking about me. See, along the way, we're all going to experience rejection. It may start when we're a youngster. It may be that we don't get picked first or last or something out on the playground. It may be that for the first time in our life, we recognize that our social status doesn't measure up to the ones around me. It may be that I try and I fail at algebra, or I don't make the dance team, or I don't make the cheer squad, or I get cut from the basketball team. At some point, we're going to hit these obstacles. If we're really fortunate, we get on further down the road before we hit them. But we're going to hit them, and they're going to come. That's called life. And so we have an opportunity to talk about trajectory, and the second word I told you was impact. Because impact is a way that we can both positively affect trajectory or negatively affect trajectory. You see, I have had people in my life that are going to come along like a booster rocket and come alongside me and take me to a higher place. I've had others come along and intersect my life in college and in other places, and it wasn't intentional, but they came into my life, and because of that intersection in my life, they projected me to a higher trajectory. I've also had people in my life, as you have, I call them, they find a way to frag you, friendly fire. Okay? They don't necessarily intend it. They're on our team, but they're the ones telling, well, you just can't do that. You know? Man, you're stupid. You're not talented. You're not smart enough for this. You're not pretty enough for this. What? They frag you. They're dream killers. Okay? And so that trajectory, and we allow that impact to take us to a lower level. Got to be careful with dream killers and stay away from them. And then there's what I even call IEDs. IEDs are those big things we didn't see coming. Don't have much control over the fact that you run it down a road and something blows you up. Death, cancer, the loss of a loved one, divorce. A lot of things come big into our life. And if we don't have help, that trajectory is going to run right into that mountain and crash and burn. Now, all that seems very, come on, let's get a little upbeat here. Okay? I want to tell you about my trajectory of my life. I can't explain it. I do not understand it. But here's what I know. When I left school, because of the way I was raised and because of the people that had been an influence in my life, I absolutely believed I could do anything. Or that I could learn to do anything. That if I didn't know how, I was smart enough to learn how to do it, and I could accomplish anything I really set my mind to. That was how I was ushered off. I think if you go back and use my analogy, you'd probably see booster rockets, you'd probably see interceptors, you'd see all kinds of things that took my trajectory and sent it to here. But like some of you, and like I didn't have a lot of excuses. I had 2 parents at home. I had, working parents that thought the best of me. They got me around good people. All those things that we do for our kids, that was my life. And so I had that trajectory. But I propose to you, had I not had people come along my life, that maybe when I'd gotten fired or when I'd gotten a really bad loss out in public and when I'd gotten benched as a senior in college and all those things that happen in your life, I would propose to you, maybe I'd have crashed and burned as well. But I had folks coming into my life. All right, I want to take you back to 2 months ago when Travis asked me here, and maybe we'll get this to work. Not working. Oh, there we are. How many of you are here to hear Clifton Talbert? Were you not incredibly blessed? I sat on the edge of my seat right over there as he vividly painted the picture of his life and his story and how that story can impact others. One of the things he used, let's see if we can figure this out. There we go. He used that word right from the get-go, impact. And I sat right over there and I'm going, ooh, this might just tie in. Impact. Because he went on to say, someone else made the difference in my life. Someone else made the difference in my life. I'm telling you, I had a much different trajectory when I started off in my life than Clifton did. If you remember his story, grew up in the poor South. He didn't have a lot other than opportunities. His opportunities were different than mine, though. Mine started this way. His was a little lower. I don't know if you remember the story. He had a great-grandpa that opened the screen door. He said, I want to go, I want to see the world, and Grandpa opened the door. And he thinks back positively to having a grandpa that wasn't a dream killer, that opened the door for him. And his trajectory got bumped up a little bit. Can you picture what I'm saying? Here's a guy headed this way, but something in his life happened and went on. And he went on to talk about Mrs. Knight. I don't know if you remember Mrs. Knight and the library and the job and the books and all the things that she did, and how, I don't know what his age is today, but he's still talking about Mrs. Knight. You think she had an impact on his life? Do you think she might have helped the trajectory of his life? There's no doubt in my mind. No doubt in my mind. I want to tell you a couple of stories. Let's see, let me give you one more. Clifton talked about setting up the next generation. I want to talk to you about that. I want to tell you a little bit about my story, and then we're going to go talk about a couple of other stories. I grew up in the major metropolitan area of Spiro, Oklahoma. Anybody know where that is? Southeastern Oklahoma? Go to Fort Smith, come back across the border. That's where I grew up. My dad was the coach there. Some of y'all that are old enough can appreciate the fact that if you were the coach, back in those days, you were the coach. My dad was the head football coach. He was the head boys basketball coach. He was head girls basketball coach. He had one assistant coach that helped him with everything. And so in the spring, my dad was the assistant track coach, and his assistant was the head track coach. And in the summer, he coached baseball and softball and everything else he could do in the summer. I was the middle son of 3 boys born into that family. I tell people I didn't understand that there were things called winter, spring, summer. I just knew football, basketball, baseball. When you said, what season is it? It's football, basketball. I mean, that's the way I was raised. Our boys, I was the middle of the 3. Our mom was a high school English teacher who would also tell you what a great basketball player she'd been. Okay? But she was a high school English teacher. Now, as my life went on, even though my dad coached my older brother, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, my dad got an opportunity to become the high school principal. So I didn't get him to coach me on the field. That didn't keep him from coaching me in the living room. You guys know what I'm talking about? I mean, we've blocked out couches and we've done all kinds of things about getting position in the living room, even though he wasn't coaching me on the court or on the field. But he was the principal. I got into high school and got the privilege of taking my mom for senior English. Not a great moment in your life when your mom sends you to see your dad down in the principal's office. You know that whole deal about you'll get whipped at school, you'll get whipped at home? I got that like 3 times over because he was at school and then he was at home. Somehow I survived. Very blessed to have had a family that raised me to go and do and to, I told you how I felt. And I give my mom and dad a lot of that credit, but they also exposed me to people that would come alongside and help me and make me have an opportunity. We were sitting at my table over here, and I hadn't thought about this. They asked, who's your favorite teacher or coach? And I was talking about my science teacher in high school and how his influence in my life changed what I wanted to do with my career. I wanted to be a pre-med major. I love science because of him. So I was a pre-med major at Tulsa for 1 semester until I got my grades. And then I became a biology major. Got my degree in biology. But people came alongside me. I got the chance to go to the University of Tulsa. I got my degree. I was going to go to work, but because of people that intersected my life in that dorm and in this community of Tulsa, I went to work for Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And I did that for 3 years because those were the people that had come into my life that directed and changed and impacted the trajectory of my life. 3 years into working for FCA, having been a former quarterback at Tulsa, a buddy called and asked me, would you ever like to coach? And I'm like, man, I always wanted to coach. I loved learning about coaching. I thought I was really smart. I thought I knew football, but I didn't. I kind of had that quarterback in me. Any of y'all know quarterbacks? Most of us, think we're pretty good. I mean, most of us, self-esteem is not an issue. And so I was not going to be the guy that needed to go start at junior high and be a 7th grade coach and work my way up. I'm like, I'm good. I would think I'm not going to. Anyway, I didn't tell anybody that, but that's the way I felt. So my buddy Bob calls and he says, have I got a deal for you? We want you to be the football coach at a little private school here in town, Eastwood Christian School. And I said, well, he said, we really want you to be the head coach. Well, we finally met a smart guy here. What I didn't know at the time is that the school had gone through a split and they had begun what became Metro Christian. And Metro and Eastwood basically split the students and they hired a guy to kind of be the youth director to keep the kids around. The deal was, I guess most of the football players went to Metro because they weren't there where I went. At least that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Because after 1 year in my chosen profession, we were 2-8. And I can't tell you how bad those 2 teams have to have been for us to have beaten them. The next year we were 3-7 because we got a forfeit, and I count that forfeit in my resume today. So after 2 years, I've won 5 games, lost 15 as a coach. And the most amazing thing happened. I found my passion and my calling. I wasn't even very good. That's not a good thing. About the time you figure out you like something, they close the school down. So now I'm unemployed. So I go find a job. I get a job as assistant coach at Sapulpa, and I stay there a year, and I'm working with a guy named Steve Spavital. Some of you guys may know him. We became lifelong friends and worked together over the years. But I was working with Spav at Sapulpa, and the coach at my old high school, Spiro, I saw where he retired. And I'm like, here's my chance. I'm going to call my old high school, my alma mater. So I get a hold of the superintendent, and I said, look, I think I ought to be your next head coach. Now think about this. I've won 5 games in 2 years. One of those by forfeit. Superintendent says, I think you'll be a really good coach someday. He said, I think you need a little more experience. I said, well, I really think I'm ready, and I think I'm the guy, and I think we can do something really special here. I think you ought to hire me to be your head football coach. And he goes, I really think you'll be a good coach. I really do. I just think you need a little more experience. I said, Dad, I really want the job. This is an absolute true story. Amazingly, my dad hires me. Now, I say that because in that time in my life, I had no idea the limb he had walked out on. Can you imagine being in a small town America and the superintendent hires his son to be the new football coach, who in his first 2 years as head coach has won 5 games, one of those by forfeit? Wouldn't make you feel real good about I showed up and the teacher still called me Billy Don. That was a little awkward. I'm the coach, Well, Billy Don, we'll let you. I'm like, I'm Coach Blankenship. No, you're not. Thankfully, in those years there, we actually had really good teams. And it kind of got my dad off the hook, and we got a trajectory going as a coach, and things happened. But what I want to tell you about is his story. I want to tell you about my dad. Oh, before I get there, that's not my dad. Before we get there, let me brag for just a minute. And I know that's against the ethics principles, so I'm not really. Billy Graham said it. So if Billy Graham said it, we believe it. Billy Graham said a coach will impact more people in 1 year than the average person does in a lifetime. Now, that's an incredible statement. I've heard it before. Now, please bear with me, because I speak a lot tongue-in-cheek, and I do enjoy my own sense of humor. I'm not sharing this for me. Stay with me, and you're gonna understand when we talk about coaches impacting, that this is about all of us. I want to talk about my dad for a minute. That's my dad. He's the smaller guy on the left. My dad had 3 brothers. He was the third of the brothers. That's my grandma back there behind him. That's his oldest brother standing behind him. And this is about, as they tell the story, it's about 3 or 4 years after what I'm getting ready to tell you. I don't know how well you all can see those pictures, but I'm not trying to play a game that I'm poorer than you or that we're more, but I'm just telling you, you see the house, the porch that they're standing in front of? That's not their home. That's their aunt's home. That's my grandmother's sister's home. Back behind there is where these guys all slept. Okay, just to try to drive this home for a minute. You see, my grandma married a gentleman, I use that term lightly, who was a drunk and abusive. He would drink, he'd get drunk, he'd come home, he'd knock her around, he'd be ugly, and he'd do all that stuff. At the point that the oldest brother was 12 years old, my grandpa came home and was getting after my grandma, apparently, and my uncle, 12 years old, stepped in between them and said, "That's enough." My grandpa took a horsewhip and beat my uncle, and then got in his car and went back to town to go drinking again. I just tell you that because that's the story they told me. That day, after he took the horsewhip to my uncle Dwight, as soon as he left, my grandmother got the boys and said, "Get everything together. and they put everything in their house, not this place, but where they were living, into 3 flour sacks. Some of you are old enough to understand what a flour sack is. They put everything they owned in 3 flour sacks, and the big brother carried the little brother, who was a toddler at the time. And the other 2 boys each carried a flour sack, as did my grandma, and they got on the railroad track, and they went to this house, 6 miles away. They said they went on the railroad track because they were afraid their dad would come home and catch them on the road and throw them in the truck or car and bring them back home, and everybody'd get beat and whatever. But by going on the railroad track, they might be able to get away. They got to her sister's house, and her sister and her husband were farmers, and they said, you could stay with us. But the fact is, they had 4 kids, and they didn't have a house that could take 4 kids, and so they put them in the lean-to back at the back. You can sleep, you can come in here to eat, and do all that, but y'all will sleep out there, which they thought was great. I'm telling you all that story to tell you that that's the superintendent of schools that hired me. Now, let that sink in for a minute. Let that sink in. I want to go on to tell you that my grandmother was completely uneducated. She might have gone to school to the 5th grade. That's for some debate. Totally uneducated. Raising 4 boys in what I would call poverty. All 4 of those boys went on to get master's degrees. All 4 of those boys 3 of them became coaches and teachers. The youngest one became a music teacher. All 4 found spouses, stayed married. From all practical evaluations, we say successful. When I asked them, as they were, only the youngest is still alive, but as we used to talk about this, how did your mom do this? How did that happen? The only stories they could come up with consistently was Mom made us go to school and Mom kept us in church. She didn't know anything else to do, but she kept them in church and she kept them in school. And then they would tell stories about the guy that ran the hardware store giving them a pair of sneakers. And then they'd talk about another guy in town or one of the teachers that made sure they had this or that. They got involved in athletics. They stayed in school. All 4 of them eventually served in various wars. The youngest was in Korea. He likes to tell he came home on my birthday when I was born. So they've had a pretty interesting life. And how did that happen? Impact. Impact. Because their trajectory, folks, would you agree with me? Their trajectory of just what they had to work with. And yet, now, flash back to my story. I didn't have any of that. I didn't know any of that. My mom and dad were teachers. We thought we were the rich kids in town. Now let that sink in. I mean, really, I thought I had it. I think back to the wisdom of, I don't know what else to do, but I'm going to get them around people. I'm going to get them around people at church. I'm going to get them around people at school. And other people came along and became booster rockets and interceptors, because I would imagine they had opportunities for people to tell them they couldn't do things. Or maybe you don't have the social status, I would guess. That leads me to a few other stories. You're going to love this. All right, there's some of my coaches. Each of them have a story. I'm going to focus for a minute on the guy that looks like Santa Claus. He actually would finish our state championship, had to go to the mall because he was taking orders the next. Anyway, no, that's different. His name is Paul. It's his story, but I want to tell you some highlights of his story. Paul grew up in Turley. Paul didn't have my life. Paul had a life like my dad. And after the man who had been his father left, his mom bounced around the city. They moved consistently all over, had nothing in their life going on. He tells, vividly remembering they were in an apartment over in kind of what we would call Midtown now, a little over closer to Sheridan. And he would leave his apartment and sneak across the street to the parking lot and get up in a cab of a semi to sleep because of the parties and the drugs that were going on in his house. Mom finally gets a new boyfriend. Things are going a little better. He says, we're going to move to Spiro. He thinks, Paul, it's funny to hear Paul say, I thought we were moving to Sperry. So we all jumped in the car. He said he kept driving and kept driving. I'm like, I think I know where Sperry is, and this ain't Sperry. Winds up coming to Spiro. It happened to be during the time I was back there coaching. Okay? I didn't know him, didn't know most of this story. Paul is in coaching today. Go back to what Billy Graham said. Paul is impacting more people in a year than most of us do in a lifetime. He's in coaching. And you know where he wanted to go back to coach? Spiro. Because he talks about the pharmacist, the person at church, the person at school, the people that came into his life that invested in him. And he absolutely learned to grow and overcome and become what he is today. One of our great coaches. That's one story. That's him in the back. See him kind of photobombing? What's more interesting about this picture, though, is these two holding the trophy in that state championship game are brothers. One's a junior and one's a freshman. Love that. See those two little guys down there? Those are my grandsons. They're the ones really photobombing. The picture has nothing to do with them, and they were wanting to be in the picture. It's the state championship. Grandpa just won. Man, we got to take pictures. Now get this, please. My grandkids have not a clue of the struggle. Their life, their destiny, their trajectory was changed 50, 60 years ago when somebody changed the trajectory of my father's life. Do you get that? Not only did my father's life change, my life changed. And guess what? My kids' lives. And guess what? 3 generations removed, my grandkids, they think normal is education and jobs and church and staying married and staying with your children. That's what they think is normal. They don't know any different. Because somewhere along the way, somebody impacted my father. I'll show you a couple more. I'm trying. You might have to help me. All right, bald-headed dude right there. Both those guys are great coaches. They both have stories. That's Antonio. I'm going to briefly tell you Antonio's story. Go ahead and go to the next one, please. This is Antonio with some of our players. You can go through. There's about 3 pictures of Antonio. I'm going to quickly tell you Antonio's story. That's Antonio with some more of our players. Hold on that one right there. I'll come to that. Antonio grew up in Alabama. Antonio had a father that he thought was his father. Wasn't his father, but his stepfather. So a policeman there. One thing led to another. Antonio had 3 younger siblings, or 4. I don't remember the story. He can tell you the story. I'm going to give you the highlights. Antonio's father left what he thought was his father. His mom, who had had him when she was 14, decided she hadn't quite had a growing up period, even though she now had 4 kids. So she would stay out and she'd do things. And so Antonio was little, and he was, because he's the oldest, he was the one staying with the kids and doing all that stuff. We hear those stories all the time. I just don't know a lot of them. His mom got in trouble. She winds up getting in the system somehow, and so they go to stay with Grandma. Grandma, as I remember the story, either passes or something happens, and so now what's going to happen to the kids? So the dad, the police officer, comes back to get his kids, being the man that he is. And so he got his 3. He didn't take Antonio because he wasn't his. So Antonio's going to go into foster care. He's going to go into the system in Alabama. And somehow they track down his father, who's living in Tulsa. And so Antonio comes to live with a guy that's his birth father that he's never met in his life, doesn't know anything about him. And this could be bad, but it actually turned out to be pretty good. Dad had a decent job. He worked seasonal work. He paid his bills. He was raising Antonio, got him involved in some school stuff, got him involved in football, and in the 9th grade moved him over to Union. And he was starting in school there, and he was one of our football players. I knew he was a good linebacker. That's all I knew about Antonio. I didn't know anything else. But I liked him as a football player. Christmas Eve, his 9th grade year, his dad is delivering presents in North Tulsa, gets shot and killed. Because Antonio just moved to Union and because he was absolutely fearful that he was going back in the system somewhere and be shipped back, he told nobody. Nobody in Union what had happened in North Tulsa. Because his dad was responsible, he'd paid his bills. Antonio gets to stay in the apartment. He has food, he has money, he has some things for a couple of months. It takes almost 2 months before the folks at Union figured out that something's wrong here. This kid that's 14 is basically living on his own, and we can't find any parents. And guess what? Oh, an English teacher, special ed teacher, a coach, a counselor, and Antonio has an opportunity. And Antonio becomes the captain of our team in senior year. The story I just told you, think about his trajectory and all the things that were trying to cause him to crash. But some people came alongside him, and he's moving on. He becomes a captain. He's being recruited. I don't know if you can imagine, but academically he was a little behind. And so he actually signed with Pitt State, but he was going to have to do an academic red shirt because he was behind. Shocking that somebody with that trajectory would be a little behind. I hope you can appreciate my sarcasm. A year after he gets Pitt State, he finally gets eligible. He starts playing, and he winds up his last year at Pitt State as the captain of their team. He finishes with a degree in psychology from Pitt State. You know what he wants to do when he gets out of school? I want to coach. Antonio goes back to Union to coach with Coach Frederick at Union because he can't imagine doing anything different. I'm an assistant coach at the time. I get to be head coach. When I get to be head coach, I talked to Antonio. I said, hey, how about you ever thought about being a graduate assistant coach? I don't know, Coach. What's that mean? Well, you got to come work on your master's degree. And, well, you know, I'm not very good. And I'm like, I know. 2.5 years, he gets his master's degree from the University of Tulsa. Now, for all you OU and OSU fans, let me tell you, we actually have to go to class at Tulsa. Okay? He actually had to do the work. Antonio now has a master's degree from the University of Tulsa. He came to Owasso this year to coach with me. I don't know if any of you remember, but when we played Union in the first game, it went to double overtime, and then after the game that night, we didn't even know it, but this young man, Kevion Cooper, suffered a traumatic brain injury and was in the hospital. Antonio's at my house. We're having chili and eating, you know, whatever you do after the game. We get a call from Coach Frederick and said, you know, is Antonio around? Yes. The Coopers really would like Antonio to come to the hospital because Kevion's in bad shape. So I go with Antonio. We go visit. This is several weeks later. Kevion's obviously made a great recovery, the whole thing. Think about the impact Antonio's making with other people. Not just Kevion, All those other guys that I told you. Can you imagine being a head coach and having a guy on your staff and somebody wants to come in and have an excuse? Why don't you talk to Coach Graham? Coach Graham doesn't really, those excuses don't really fly. He's kind of been there, done that. Interesting, right? Impact. And again, it wasn't the coach. Maybe I had parts of it, maybe. But I'm telling you, there was an English teacher, a counselor, special ed teacher, and coaches that made the difference in his life. And they've continued on. Let's go to the next one, please. Remember pictures of my dad I was telling you about? Please don't forget that there were others. That's my Uncle D.O., that they were only separated by a few months. D.O. stood for Derwin Odell, but I knew him for years as D.O. Derwin Odell. Go to the next picture, please. Derwin Odell's grandson is Zach Simmons, who's coaching for me. Now let that sink in for a minute. It's not my dad's. That's another son in that family. Another son who somebody somewhere impacted enough for him to take a different trajectory. And now, guess what? Zach has no clue. I don't mean he has no clue. I'm saying he didn't start. He started like I did. He started with a different trajectory because somebody had invested in his grandpa and helped make a difference in their life. I go back to this, and so don't think for a minute that I'm trying to tell you that being a coach is what I'm trying to brag about. I'm just telling you, Billy Graham saw what coaching, and again, coaching to me is helping people do what they say they want to do, even when they don't want to do it. Okay? You tell me what you want to do, I'm going to help you do it, even though you may be too tired or it doesn't feel good today. That's coaching for us, is helping come alongside. For some of my players, I'm a booster rocket. For some of them, maybe it's just that intersection and intercepting that happened during this season, that maybe something they saw or did or somebody else that came in. When my kids went to college, my consistent prayer was, God, please let people intersect their life that will influence them and will direct them in the ways that we want them to go. We all have an opportunity. I've kind of give you a snippet of my story. I've given you a snippet of my dad's story, a snippet of these stories. Some of you all in this room are in my dad's shoes. You didn't have the example. But you're finding a way. Some of you have had it like me. We're pretty good. What are we doing, though, to make a difference? What are we doing to impact the next generation, like Clifton Talbert said? How are we being intentional about it? It's one thing to walk out here and go, well, that was a good story. It's another thing to develop a strategy for yourself on how am I going to be the one that gives the tennis shoes? How am I going to be the one that comes along and says, what does it take for you to be in dance? What do I have to do to keep somebody interested in science? I just think we all have gifts, and I think we all have opportunities to do that. I'm so blessed that I've gotten to do this long enough that God's given me a little different view, because I wasn't intentional about this as a coach when I got into coaching, but I am now. And I'm very excited that now I see the perpetual view of that if I help you, it's not just about you, bro. It's about your kids and your grandkids and the next generation after them. And so we can make a difference for our world by investing in a few that we can change their trajectory and help them get over those mountains, help them not to crash and burn when something bad happens. We just shared a story that we have in common of getting fired, or getting to lose what we thought we wanted. You know what? In another part of my life, that might have been just the thing that made me crash and burn. But because of the people that had come into my life, I was able to get over that mountain. Maybe my feelings were hurt, but it propelled me instead of caused me to crash. We all have that opportunity. Give me one more picture. I'm going to finish where we started. Champions, I just went ahead and circled those 3 guys that we talked about, but I could circle anybody in there. We could circle you in the crowd and begin to tell the story about impact and trajectory. So I want to give you that to think about. I've got just a couple of minutes that I could answer a couple of questions if we wanted to and still stay on time, I think.
Coach,
yes, sir.
what's the biggest difference you see or that you experienced between coaching high school and then coaching Division I football?
There's a couple of key things. One, if you didn't hear him, the biggest difference between high school coaching and college coaching, one is the money. Really like the money in college. You don't see college coaches walking out. They're getting paid. Okay. The other thing is we don't deal with parents. I got in trouble once early in my career because I told them at Union that I wasn't looking at any other jobs unless the state, school for orphans came calling, and it just went just about like it did here. Just.
But what are the differences in how you talk to the kids, how you motivate the kids?
Very little difference. Yeah, football is football, and those are just big boys. Now you have to understand they're talking about other subjects. I had one of my favorites stay one day, and he's playing for the Buffalo Bills right now, and he came in and he said, "Coach, how do you know if she's the one?" I'm like, well, I never had a high school kid ask me that, but that's kind of cool. I'm not sure I had an answer, but that was, sometimes the subjects are a little different, but they really are just guys that, in college, the reason coaches deal with all that is they don't have a principal and they don't have counselors and they have to do all of that stuff in college. In high school, you got a lot of help. You get a lot of people wearing different hats that try to do that. One more. Yes, ma'am.
In regards to Antonio's story, do you know when they found out about what happened to his dad, who actually took care of him until he made it to the senior year period? There was a few years there. I just like to know.
Yeah, it was those people I mentioned to you. He lived with some of them at different times and went back and forth and they just kind of came alongside and said, we're going to make sure he gets it done. He did have an uncle who was a guardian, and that didn't necessarily work out real good, but at least the point was there was more than just one person. It took a village, or whatever it takes, but they found a way. Anyway, Travis, come on up. Thank you so much.